That's the difference.
That makes a difference.
I can help it. So, thank you all so much for coming out tonight, for being here and part of this evening's conversation. We're very grateful. We're starting 5 minutes early, so we can finish up 5 minutes early and have the extra 5 minutes to get home or whatever. It's great to see all of you. Most of you have heard the good news. I do have one announcement. Most of you heard the good news that Tony, our music minister, is home from the hospital. And we are very grateful. Having a couple of back and forth, but he's home and in good shape. So we are very, very grateful because he was there for a while. So tonight we are welcoming Matthew Henry. We are delighted to do so, and I'm honored to be introducing Matthew. Tonight is actually the first time Matthew and I have met in person, but I feel like I know him really well because we've been emailing for 6 months. And I've been reading about Matthew, and we shared some interests and some conversations. So it's great to have you here, Matthew, with us. Matthew actually contacted Catherine and me about 6 months ago and said, I understand you have an arts program at church and maybe even some poetry meetings. And we said, absolutely, and we're looking for another poet. And he said, well, maybe we should talk. And we did. So Matthew Henry is, and he goes by Matthew or M.E.H. Matthew is an educator and a theologian. It's a very good combination. I recommend it. He has taught at every level of schooling, high school, college, graduate school. He's currently teaching in the Weston Public Schools and came down here this afternoon straight from Weston to make it here for our evening tonight. He has a doctorate from Lesley, and most of all, for our evening together, he is a poet. He said he actually started doing a little poetry in high school when he was trying to send love poems to some young ladies that may or may not have too much. But in college, he found that poetry was a means of expression that worked for him a lot better than essays or other kinds of documents. He could say things in poetry that he couldn't say in other ways. And so our great opportunity tonight is to have Matthew saying those things in poetry and sharing some of his expertise with us. He wrote at one time, his writing shines a black light on the bed of education, race, relationships, religion, and everything else you're not supposed to discuss in polite company. He's been known to make some people sad, angry, and uncomfortable. And that's always part of sharing messages of great importance. So with that, we welcome Matthew to this podium, and all the rest of you are invited to have additional food or dessert or whatever you want. But thank you, Matthew.
Did everyone hear me?
Yes.
So I'll probably be a lot louder than this. Thank you all so much for inviting me. Thank you for being here. I am Matthew E. Henry. I'll be reading some poems, and I'm going to leave enough time at the end for questions, comments, concerns, queries, conundrums. I'm a high school teacher, so I'll try to not use my teacher voice the entire time because that'll be really loud and deafening, but we'll see what happens. So largely I'm going to be reading from my second full-length collection, which is called The Third Renunciation. Some background on this, I'll actually read the dedication. For Chase Alexander Porch, December 21st, 2007 through February 25th, 2008. So this collection came out, the beginning of the collection came out while I was wrestling with the death of my grandchild. Grandchild being that I'm a high school teacher, two of my kids, like my high school students, had a baby, as they would want to do. And so we had it in December. In early January, they brought in, and I'm like holding this baby. I was like, yay, 2 of my screw-up kids have had a kid of their own, and they're so happy. And then in February, their child had passed. I found out when one of the school resource officer, police people, came in my room and said, there are 2 kids looking for you in the office. I'm like, I'm teaching right now. What do you want from me? Like, they lost their baby. Yeah, it's off right now. They lost their baby, and I'm thinking they mean... Oh, there we go. I'm thinking they mean that, their child was lost somewhere in the mall, I don't know, but they meant that their child had died. And so I find myself in the office trying to comfort 2 of my kids, and answering questions like, should the last time that I see my baby be when I found him dead in the crib, or go right now to the funeral home to dress him one last time, or let strangers do that? And I was an education major, but they didn't train us for that. I went to a Christian school, we still weren't trained for that. So I was in my MFA program. I was talking about it. I was in my MFA program while this was happening, and one of my advisors gave me some poetry to read that really sort of stuck, and they were mostly sonnets. And so I started going through this process of trying to capture all the theological and mental and emotional stuff I was going through in the form of a sonnet. So that is what this is. It was about 11 years of writing different poems, all sonnets loosely, and they all start with either the word say or maybe. They all propose ideas about God, about grace, about love, about something theological as I was wrestling through this time and since. I'm going to borrow something from another poet who I was reading with once. She wrote a collection that was based off of her own journeys in spirituality, and she said, that's why I'm stealing it. She's like, this is my journey. It might cause offense to other people, that's not the intention. There might be lines, there might be images, there might be thoughts that some people are not happy with. And she apologized on the front end about that, but that wasn't the intention. It was about capturing where she was in her relationship. For me, this collection is sing. So I'll be reading largely from here, and then a couple of poems from some other collections. At the end, I want to leave some time for questions and comments, and yelling at me, whatever works. The first section of this collection is about difficult questions that come up. Say the fear of the Lord begins wisdom, and our reading of Scripture is so filled with fiery serpents, floods, assorted angels of death, plagues, and prophet-eating lions, all heaven sent to shift the earth beneath unholy feet. It causes us to seek safety in Lewis's gray words about Aslan. Of course he's not safe, but he's good. Like trusting the disquieting beauty of straight lines in nature, we pray good means the same on both sides of the grave, as he measures how all things work. The wise see beyond meanings, see beyond beginnings, know the difference kneeling before his awesome and awful might. I had a student ask me that question once. They're like, the root of the word awful and awesome both have awe at the beginning, and the Bible applies both to God, but one is very positive, one is very negative, but awe is still at the front. Maybe Jesus didn't eat his spinach. Michael thought the sermon went rather well. How he, without sin, should cast the first stone. Later, Bible closed, he wondered. After carving their sins into a gasping ground, what would Jesus do had they grabbed her arms and righteous rocks crying out for justice? Remain a passive bystander, kneeling as crushed skull flecks onto his face, or call legions of angels to halt the horror? Considering all he's counseled that God has allowed, words of comfort built upon some mystery good, all things work toward. His most honest theology scares him. The second section, I'm just going to run through some of these. The second section asks the question, what if we're the problem? Like, we'll ask a lot of questions of God, of the divine, but what if it's about us? This takes a quote from St. Augustine. It's a famous one that has different variations. One is, Lord, make me holy, but not yet. Or, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. It's one of the baby sonnets. Maybe Jesus just needed to get laid. Ever the student of Augustine, chaste Lord, but not yet. Micah eyed the red Gideon Bible closed on the nightstand. Remembers the words read before dialing. Disciples, unable to watch and pray, falls into temptation. Lace panties lie at the bathroom door. The shower's running. Her name's lost to him like steam. Fire smoke in a garden. The thurnible's incense he'll swing in morning mass. The shower stops. The spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. He puts his bones back on, finds his wallet, leaves her wages atop worn leather. Say hell is reserved for those who don't replace toilet rolls or place them beside the holder. Oh, and Lucifer, fallen angels, and all the usual suspects, rapists, child molesters, murderers, wife beaters, racists, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, shitty people overall. The 7 deadly sinners deserving punishments equal their crimes. And the asshole who cut you off in traffic. Your middle school bully. People who vote for fill in the blank. Those who don't believe correctly in God. Thus, its tortures are divinely designed for evil manners not made in your image. When I was writing that poem, I had a list of things in my head, and I was thinking, how often do we condemn other people, but it's just the folks we don't like? We don't have a necessarily like a good theological or legal reason, we just don't like them. I gave one of my students, or a class, an assignment of whether you believe in hell or not, who would you send there? And they made a list. They didn't have to think about it. But if I gave them the same assignment of who would go to heaven, they got quiet. So I'm going to read a couple of poems from the colored page. This is a semi-autobiographical journey through my life. Some of you have heard of the M.E.H program. I'm a M.E.H student in Wellesley. So for those who don't know, busing did not end in like the 60s and the 70s. It still goes on right now. I work in Weston, which is a busing district still. So I was bused into Wellesley from age, I went early, so like 3.5. So I learned what racism was really early. So I'm going to read a few poems, both from the student side, but then also the teacher side. This is a very short one. My third grade teacher. My third grade teacher explained skin, the undercurrents of blood, and how my face lacked the ability to bruise or brush. I tried to show her a patch darker than the rest. She nodded, explained it was harder to see on my skin. Jumping ahead to 4th grade. Self-evident. Do any Boston natives, Massachusetts natives, mostly in the room? Okay, so there might be there's not going to be a quiz at the end, but you should recognize some of the places involved here. If not, you failed social studies. Self-evident. As a kid from Boston, the Revolutionary War was my favorite subject in 4th grade. A tea party I could respect. Class trips vainly searching for musket balls in Lexington treetops. Reading of Decapitation by Cannonball on Breed's Hill. Even the sites in Southie, unsafe for me to visit, were a source of tribal pride, like rooting for the Patriots. We were told to don our colonial imagination caps and tell our story of emancipation from the British.
where would we be? The Old South Meeting House? The Old North Church? What would we see as we rose to American greatness? Our teachers should hear freedom ringing in the streets through our words. I drop my head to begin, oversized pencil in hand, until I remember. Seeing my inaction, she crouched and began to re-explain. I patiently waited for her to finish, eyes on her lips, then asked if she wanted me to pretend to be white, or to picture myself for sale on the steps of Faneuil Hall, or stacked in one half of the harbor ships heading to and from the West Indies, explaining my parents' patois. After the vocal statics, the hems and haws of white noise, she suggested Crispus Attucks, the hometown boy, the black hero of the Boston Massacre. My siblings had taught me the one-drop rule and when to nod my head politely, so I pretended he was not half Wampanoag, that Framingham was not his master's home, and imagined myself the first unarmed black man shot on these urban streets. I was going back to the third renunciation when I was reading the book before this. There was a book, my first collection was called Teaching All Black. It was a short little chapbook. And through connections at Leslie, I ended up getting interviewed by someone who, actually not, I think lives in Wareham, or used to live in Wareham, now that I'm like just remembering that, because she knew someone else I knew from Wareham within the Christian community, because it's small and we all know each other. And so she knew my religious background, and she said, you write a lot of poetry about school. You have a lot of poetry that is about like race and education and stuff. You have these poems that are about theology. And that was before this collection had come out. And she asked me, so are you ever going to write about theology and race? And I said, get off my back, leave me alone. That's a lot of like mental and spiritual energy I don't feel like spending. As I was putting this collection together, I ended up, her words were ringing in my head, and I was reading James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And so some of the poems in here, I'm going to read two real quick, are putting that together, the theological and the racial. This first one is loosely based on a real event. Not very loosely, pretty accurate. Maybe Jesus needed to take a nap. Replacing the Bible back in the pew, things began to fall into place. Melvin felt their whispers, their rigid stares, the lone, tentative nod. His hands remained empty as they passed their peace. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. He hears the pastor argue the purpose, the priority of Jesus' love. If his mission were a role-playing game, the Gentiles were a side quest. Sidestepping the racial slur, their pastor focuses on the woman knowing her place. Great faith, allowing her to be in his presence. All of the maybe sonnets in here are based off of, in some places, real stories, but they all are responding to a message of the gospel. And it's someone who has read a part of the gospel or been in the room for the gospel being preached, and they're taking issue with something that Jesus said, or something a pastor said about what Jesus said. This was based off of a time where I was at a church in Minnesota, and the pastor wasn't expecting any black people. He was not, when he wrote his sermon, he was not expecting it. And he happened to be preaching off the sermon, off the passage that deals with race. And so I saw him up there. He starts preaching, he's going, and he looks down and he goes, ah! It's like, how do I salvage this? So he threw in a couple of like stories about playing basketball. And then just try to find his way around it. I started writing this poem shortly after that. But like in the midst of it, there was like one person who came up to me trying to be like, our church is not racist. Our church is, I'm so sorry. I saw what happened too. But it's like, well, if you have to say that, that should tell you that there's something wrong. Does this church sing hymns on Sundays? All right. So this poem is based off of a hymn that you might recognize. Or not. We'll see what happens. Say, we survey the wondrous cross, burning outside the hanging man's home. One dying because the whole realm of nature could not hold those who don't know their place, who'd be called a man. See, from his head, his hands, his feet, blood flowing down like the love his children lost the moment he gloried in lifting his eyes from dirt. See his roped ascension. See the crowd composed, bodies thick as thorns. See contempt poured, the laughers, the pointers, the vile boasters proudly raising their charred tokens. An ear, a lip, a testicle. See how they silenced his skin, demanded his life, his all. See his divinity. There is a collection of postcards that are mentioned throughout history, but James Combs, The Cross and Lynching Tree, pointed this out probably the most starkly to me, even though I'd seen them. A lot of the famous images of lynchings in the United States that we see in textbooks and online are postcards. They were postcards that were taken at lynchings. And most lynchings took place on Sunday afternoon, after church. So people would go and, as Cohen pointed out, people would go and praise their, well, there's a cross there. They would praise their hung Savior and then go and hang someone who potentially worshiped the same God. The church doesn't have the best history when it comes to reconciling with issues of race. That's saying it mildly.
Very mildly.
Very mildly. Returning to the classroom for a moment. When asked why all lives don't matter, after a deep breath, I attempted to explain. My aunt had breast cancer. Despite a healthy dose of science and scripture, prayer and prescriptions, the shadow never dimmed. We celebrated her life, mourned the hole her grave dug in ours. We lauded her loving kindness, questioned the natural shocks that flesh is heir to, why this disease would claim a wife, a co-worker, a friend, an aunt. At the repast, heads turned to the future, saving other sons and daughters ourselves. A collection was taken to fund breast cancer research. A medical scholarship for oncology study discussed. A proposal for new... From the back of the church hall, a woman no one recognized screamed, "What about ovarian cancer and prostate cancer? Why aren't you talking about those? All cancers matter." Most of my students nodded into the ensuing silence. But some blank stares and my job description doomed me to be more didactic, to explain appropriate time, place, and manner, intent versus impact, the guilt and shame required to derail communal grief and hijack a narrative to make oneself more comfortable. I explained the human duty to choose. Enter the room willing to bear bodies on our shoulders, or arms empty leave and silently stand outside. I said, replace cancer with lives and wait. I always wait because I was at a Christian college down south, and I read that poem, and then two young ladies got up and started thieving, and I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. Did I offend you?" But they're like, "No, we've got class." I'm like, "It's 9:30 at night. We ain't got no class. It's fine. You can just you can walk out." That was taken from a real moment in one of my classrooms where the conversation about, well, why is it a problem to say all lives matter? Don't all lives matter? And it's like, sure. But that wasn't the conversation we were having. My aunt's dead of cancer, and you're like, what? Well, she died of breast cancer. Shouldn't we be talking about like all cancers? No, we're talking about one specific thing right now. The third section are all, I haven't been struck by lightning yet. The third section are, all of the sonnets have you in them, capital Y. And they're all directed directly towards God. I'll read a couple of those. Say my prayers are selfish, desperate acts. Please, on behalf of the people whose blood trails drip love to my door, whose soul screams bind, burn my heart, whose terror are tefillin hung before my eyes. So I turn to you, expecting their easing, burdens removed, blades unsheathed from their backs, because they're your children, because my hands are impotent, though I've been taught they do your will, because you said that my words, when they're your words, can manifest miracles, or magic, or something more, something other than what is, because my faith falls short, because this mustard seed sprouting is all I have. There's a poem in here that I'm not going to read, just because I probably can't get through it without crying, but I'll talk about it. I wrote this poem, and the other one that I'm not going to read is about my students. I'm a high school teacher. I've been teaching for a total of 22 years now. High school for the majority of that. And like one of the things I've learned over time is that like people go through stuff. And high school students especially go through things. And being a religious person, one of the things that has caused me to like ask why oh Lord the most has been watching my students suffer through things. Whether it's, what started this, two of my kids having a baby and that baby dying, or other things. An open letter for back to school night. Your child was sexually assaulted at a party, almost. A friend intervened as sober hands fumbled against an impaired zipper. Your child is in love with sharp edges. Clothespins, safety razors, and X-Acto knives wait, red spotted under the bed, but your maid has yet to notice. Your child hasn't eaten solid foods in 3 weeks, has slit both wrists in frenetic dreams, takes whatever colored pills are closest to hand, drinks until feeling can't be felt. Your child found your Tinder profile, your stash, those photos, the manila envelope containing the truth. Your child overheard you that night, hears what you really mean even though you're too afraid to admit it. Your child has told me these things because you're too busy posting shit about other parents on Facebook and they don't want to be a distraction. At the book launch for this book, so this poem is literally, every line is, like I'm seeing kids, like specific students who were actually at my book launch. So when I'm reading a poem that I didn't read at back to school night because COVID, so one time COVID did something good, it saved my job, because I was going to read this in front of parents. At my book launch, there was a bunch of students who were there, including people who were in this poem, and they knew about the poem, they were fine with it. I wasn't thinking that some of their parents were also in the room. And also, that last line there about posting shit on Facebook, that's what the student actually said to me. Like, they were going through something, and I was like, have you talked to your parents? They're like, well, I don't want to be a distraction. They're busy posting on Facebook. Front row is the woman who manages the Facebook page for the town. And like, as I start reading the poem, I recognize she's sitting there, and I was like, yeah, whatever. Can't stop now, I'm too far in. Like, what to do. A confession from occupied territory. It takes its title from a James Baldwin essay some of you might be familiar with, a report from occupied territory. I can usually get through this one. A confession from occupied territory. After the frantic emails, a cry for help in the middle of a night one student feared another would not survive, I called the police resisting the screaming of my skin. After weighing the sharp, bloody consequences of inaction, the cost of action crushed my chest. I couldn't breathe. For they are black, and they are they, not him, not her. I tell the dispatcher 14 times. Once for each year, they could lose, like loose cigarettes or Skittles if wearing a hood, holding a wallet or a phone. And they have a history of mental illness. So officers see knife, gun in every open hand. At least they live in a nice neighborhood. Single-family homes on red-lined land. A world where sergeants conduct wellness checks, with smiles broad as arms away from holsters. They'll even offer to remove their boots, lest they sully the foyer's imported carpet. All this is small solace. In the silence following, thank you for your call. We'll send someone right over. My kids, both of the kids involved are fine. I will give the Weston Police Department credit because they called me back shortly after doing the wellness check. They're like, this is what happened, everything. I was like, all right, well done. I'll take it. But before I made the phone call, all I was thinking was, my child could die. Like, one of my kids could be killed by the cops. Because in the news, all that I was hearing was, young black people being killed by the police. Young, non-gender-reforming kids being killed by the police. And people with mental illness being killed by the police. My kid was all three. And when I called the school to say, hey, I just got this email from their significant other, y'all should do something. They're like, why don't you call the police? I'm like, isn't this your job? No, I'll take it. Sure. I'm going to read one from there are only 5 sections. I'm going to read one from the 4th section and then a couple from the 5th section. The 4th section is what do we do when we don't like the answers that we get? Sometimes we can ask a lot of questions, we can blame God, we can blame ourselves, but sometimes we get answers. Anyone ever read the book of Job? Just favorite book. Like, it is my favorite book, but like, if you read different commentaries from different writers, you can get any answer you want out of that book. It's beautiful and confusing, which is life. Maybe Jesus needed more time to think. The disciples asked him, whose sin blinded this man from birth? His parents? Appalled, Martha cannot believe in this Jesus whose deaf answer trembles her Bible closed, so that you could see the power of God. She remembered the eyes which accused her of lapses in prenatal care, questioned her fidelity, found lawful cause for his tiny body's chronic rebellion against its own good. As the pastor reads his response, she finds their false blame better, more acceptable than sons suffering for parlor tricks, divine objects lessons. I've preached on this passage, and it's like one of the worst to preach on. Like, it's like, all right, disciples go to Jesus. Hey, Jesus, this guy's blind from birth. Who sinned, him or his parents? And Jesus is like, that's bad theology. Like, what are you talking about? It's not about his sin or his parents' sin. And I'm like, go Jesus, yeah. And then he keeps talking and says, it's so that the glory of God can be manifested in this moment. Wait, so this guy has been blind for 30 some odd years, has been suffering, his family was suffering, the community was suffering, just so he could do a miracle in this moment, and like read different commentaries. What's about? It's for us, the millions of people in the future who have were able to, get something good out of his suffering. And I'm like, I got a hard time with that. And I think of friends of mine who had a child with chronic health illness, and her saying, it's better to have people accuse me of doing some sort of a sin, and that's the reason why my child was born this way, than it just be, God had a lesson to teach other people in their lives. The last section, so I sent out this manuscript to friends, like, hey, you read through this, and they're like, can you end it a little happier? Because the whole thing is like Lamentations and Job and Ecclesiastes, and I'm like, yeah, that's where I live, and like the unhappy Psalms. And they're like, can there be a turn? I can try. This last section is focused on hope? Question mark? But sometimes hope is messy. Say grace is like a Twinkie or a cockroach. Something that never goes bad. Can survive anything the cold world throws. Bomb shelter material. A stockpile of rations. Shelves of undented cans. Jars of honey and salt. Boxes of powdered milk. A spring, cool and siltless, whose sweet waters run through copper pipes to a golden spigot. Or perhaps it's more like a megalodon, or nautilus, colocynth, or horseshoe crab. Something which swam the primordial week and the century since, adapting despite all our best efforts to quell it, and our amazement that it still remains. This was a fun one reading when my parents walked in after my book launch. Say prayer is sex with God. Biblically knowing the divine in bedrooms, mid-sized cars, with backs arched over kitchen tables, knees bent, eyes closed, fingers entwined or clasped, without saying or needing a word. With a sweet release of oxytocin and essence, desires meld like bodies, two wills become lost in one. A little death sought in the asking, receiving what the Holy Spirit craves without ceasing. The soul-shaking toe-curling pleasure. Night, noon, and morning, our flesh is willing. This blessed communion which leaves us gasping amen again and again and again. Some of you are aware of the fact, outside of watching the Seinfeld episode, that the word for, when we talk about biblical knowledge, it's because the word for knowledge in Hebrew is yada. That is the same word that was used when Adam knew his wife. So that Seinfeld had an entire joke about that. That was my inspiration for this. Because I started Hebrew for giggles. I'm going to read just 3 more poems, then open it up for questions. Or 2 more. Say our Father, who's more than in heaven, finds his name is hallowed less by coming kingdoms than by his will being done on earth. Daily bread doled out by unholy hands. The cool milk and honey of forgiveness flowing from hearts aspiring to lead and be led from temptation. Debts erased, remembering the power, the glory of allowing today's deliverance from tomorrow's evil. And on that day when I agree becomes so let it be, when our prayers become action without ceasing, we'll understand true adoption forever and ever, world without end.
Amen.
I'm going to read one last poem from my second chapbook. Taken from the Gospels, will probably be very familiar to many. It's entitled, "And Who is My Neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from insert place of work, convenience store, or church, to insert place of work, convenience store, or church, unarmed, and fell into the hand of officers who stopped him for insert aim while black reason. They shot him, stood above his leaking body, and left him for dead. Now, by chance, a white man, evangelical, was going down his Twitter feed. And when he saw him, he scrolled quickly past saying #Blue Lives Matter. Likewise, a white woman, Presbyterian, came to the place on her Facebook feed. She saw him and scrolled quickly past saying #All Lives Matter. But when insert the least expected saw him, they came near. Moved with pity and outrage, they went to the dead man's family to bandage their wounds, pouring action and appropriate silence as compassion. They put the burdens on their backs, addressed them as they were able. The next day they had not forgotten, but took 2 friends and encouraged them to more than march or #the moment, saying, We will continue to work together. Be not afraid. The Lord will repay whatever social capital we spend. Then Jesus asked, which of these three was a neighbor to the man who fell into unholy hands? Insert the idiot, first playing devil's advocate, said, the one who acknowledged his dignity. And Jesus replied, now go and do likewise. Thank you. I'd love to open it up for questions, comments, concerns, queries, conundrums, or we'll just stand here awkwardly staring at each other. Whichever. I teach high school, so I can just sit and stare for long periods of time.
I think you gave us an awful lot to think about, not being ever in your position.
Sure.
Yeah. And that's what people need to think about more. But it's very difficult not to be in with black people. I never really was in school or anything, but in work I worked. But I have to say, the few people I worked with, it never came across to me about the color of their skin. It was their work, what they did. And you don't think about that. But not knowing what you have gone through in your life is, the more you see things like that, it's really scary. To me, I don't know.
It was scary to me. Lydia and I lived on a small island, Nantucket Island, and 3,500 people, and of the kids that went to school, black, Cape Verdean, white, there wasn't any distinction. We never thought anything about it. We went to each other's homes, we had dinners, and then when we moved to the mainland, I went to the service, and I saw the prejudice, even within the military, to the point where I remember the DI saying everybody's one color in this army, and it's green, knock it off. It was sort of like a shock to me. I just couldn't understand what was the difference? What the heck was going on here? Living a jaded childhood, I thought that which was good because of the way we lived and basically played together, worked together. It was a shock coming to the mainland, actually going into the army at 19 since.
The thing that surprised me is in 1960 we moved to Virginia, and I had heard about the black restrooms and the white restrooms and drinking fountains and such, but when I opened the newspaper, the black marriages and engagements were in separate section, and that I hadn't expected. It just hit me. It was just the beginning of the breaking up of segregation. It was 1960, so. But that's what really shocked me was the separation in the newspaper.
I mean, I'll say this morning so we had a faculty meeting this morning, which I generally try not to. I'm an introvert in real life. I should probably like full 10-to-1 introvert. And so I sit in the back and crochet. So I was crocheting a scarf today just so I can not have to listen to the faculty meeting. Those who've been in faculty meetings know. But just this morning, they brought in someone from the district to talk about issues of race and racism that are still happening in the district. And there's a new initiative to try to deal with things, starting with the teachers, calling out things that they see in the classrooms. And then some of my colleagues were like, well, you want us to say something and document these things? How are we gonna document them? We have to stop class and fill in whatever. I'm just trying to sit in the back and crochet and not be present. That's all I want to do. And so
More is a meeting
Right, yeah. And so, like, I've literally, in 10 years that I've been in this building, I have spoken during a faculty meeting 4 times. And each one of those times, like in true introvert style, it's because the level of stupid has reached a certain place where you just have to say something. Introverts in the room, you know what I'm talking about. We're just like, no one's gonna say the obvious thing. So finally, I was like putting my crochet down. I was like, raised my hand, had the needle in my hand. It was like, if we're complaining about the number of times you have to report a racist incident you see in your class, doesn't that tell you that there's a problem still? Like, you're complaining that you might have to log this multiple times during your class period. Why are you not focused on the fact that, like, this is still a problem? And then I got really quiet. I was like, all right, I went back to crochet. So, I mean, things that have been from time immemorial in this country are better now. Like, I put that to my students sometimes. I'm like, are things better now? And they'll say, we don't have segregation, slavery has ended, like they'll name those big things. And then other students, usually students of color, will be like, yeah, but just because it's gone underground, or because someone isn't saying something out loud, but it's still in their heart, isn't that worse? I think it was, I can't remember who it was, Dave Chappelle, I think. There was some comedian who made the joke about the difference between the North and the South, is that down South, someone's going to call him the N-word to his face, and in some ways he was like, I almost prefer that, because like, the racism is out front, versus someone who's thinking something, and they'll smile at you while they're saying something different. And like, the number of my students who still express that idea, and they're like, yeah, I'd rather someone maybe just say something negative to my face, because then at least I know where they stand, opposed to behind the back, they're trying to like sabotage me or do something evil. I was like, you're 15 years old and you figured that out already. Geek.
You don't have to go down south. I lived in East Boston at Boston College.
Yep.
There's a difference between East Boston and overt racism and Cambridge polite
Polite
racism.
racism, yes.
Sure.
I want to thank you for all your quotes, but the one about your aunt and the breast cancer versus all cancer matters, because I wish I thought of it during more of the active Black Lives Matter. There was such a, well, of course all nobody ever wants to deny that all lives matter, but right now we're having the conversation about something specific.
Yeah, that was literally an in-class with seniors. We were actually, they were sophomores. We were having a conversation when it came up, and I was like, here's an example. And they were like, oh, yeah, that sounds terrible. I was like, before I forget that, let me write this down and turn it into a poem.
That's where poems come.
This is where poems, most of my poems come, well, for at least for these 2 collections, they're a lot school-based. Things that my kids have said or done, sometimes positive, usually, sometimes crazy. I love them, they're my babies, but some of them are crazy, and they say crazy, do crazy things, and we love them anyway. But poetry comes for me often from my lived experience. The collection I'm working on right now, one of them is more off of artwork, but usually I draw from life.
I saw on TV the other day something that I think is encouraging, and it was 4 or 5 people who are, well, Bob Kraft was one of them, the NBA chairman, a bunch of different sports, whatever the right term, and they're all trying to work on a program primarily to do with racism. So I thought that, and not only that, but I thought, well, that's encouraging, you know, that at least it's being talked about, hopefully we get to rest well.
Change of all kinds, we were talking at our table, like change of all kinds come when people are actually in honest and open communication, opposed to just kind of, I like where I work, I love my kids, but I work at, you've heard of Weston, I'm assuming. One of the things that I say to my kids on a regular basis is, when I worked out in Colorado and I worked with kids who were very poor, high immigrant population, like broken homes, like just, I worried about them a lot less than I worry about my kids in Weston, because they were going through a lot of the same things, but they knew that they needed help. In Weston, everything is, how are you doing today? I'm fine. life is great. No, there's no problems. Everything is wonderful. And I'm like, you're lying. Like, I know things are wrong. And so then conversations about anything have that veneer. So whether it's talking about race or talking about LGBTQ plus things or talking about theology or religion, or as long as there's a veneer and people don't want to communicate to each other, there's never any progress, really. It's just keep creating the same fakeness. And everyone feels we've done a good job having a conversation, but it wasn't really a conversation. If like your heart wasn't involved at all, if it was just, what's the thing that I can say that, what's the phrase we use? What's the thing that I can say that won't get me canceled, that won't get someone angry at me, that won't get somebody mad at me? If that's the starting point, it's good to be polite, but not at the expense of not actually like connecting with another human being and knowing, what are they thinking? What are you honestly thinking?
You know, when years ago, 1988, when we were working in Alabama on Hank Sanders' political campaign, Hank was being persecuted by the federal government for vote fraud. So we were all recruited to go to Alabama and go out and knock door to door. So there were lots of sparkly people who were, what are they going to sell? What are we going to fix these people in Alabama? And it was well, surprising in many ways. I mean, some of the folks who had never seen houses like some people live in. Some people had an assumption that going door to door to campaign for a black man would be easy. And when this young woman walked up onto the step because she was the beloved daughter of a Boston political person, she knocked on the door and said, "I'm here for Hank Sanders." And the very lovely lady behind the door with the two Rottweilers looked at her and said, "You get off of my porch, you black bitch." And so she, young woman, promptly began to explain in very explicit language to this lady what she could do with her nastiness. Whereupon the lady started to open the door with the dogs. Pulled her down the steps. But that sense that somehow we assume that we are somehow so privileged to not even think about our own real protection, rather we just, well, we can say whatever shit we want. But that was a long time ago, but it really struck me that, did you see those two big dogs there? The ones that go, or in the store, when people were like, we got some yellow dogs running around here. Don't you think we ought to get some guns and go shoot at some yellow dogs? And the guy next to me from Minnesota says, I didn't know they had wild dogs around here. So, privilege is
It's blindness.
It's blindness, yeah. It's also blindness. Like we don't, I mean, as you said before, we don't often see outside of our own selves unless someone holds either a mirror up to us or they give us their own perspective.
And you mentioned the cancel culture. I think from teaching until recently, there's a current generation of students that are afraid to say things or to get challenged.
Yeah.
And it really it cancels those kind of important conversations.
I have a rule in my class that I don't accept I don't know as an answer. It's like, part of my job is to make you sound right. So like, speak. But we start with norms that are like, you have to respect you have to treat the other people in the room with respect. Like, just start baseline there. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things, and personal issues might come up, your biases might come up. We're going to start from a place of like respect. Our own little dysfunctional family for this, hour that we have every couple of days. And they learn slowly but surely to feel safe enough to like ask the question, to say the thing, either in a small group or in writing to me. So I have not written a poem about this, but I mean, the things that I've been asked over the years, because a kid felt comfortable enough to ask, they're like, so do black people grow tails after midnight? And this kid asked this question out loud in front of the entire class, and all the kids start laughing and giggling, and I was like, wait, hold on. Don't laugh. Did you hear this from your grandma? She's like, yes. Is your grandmother from Germany? She's like, how did you know? I was like, this is a Germanic wives' tale that I had heard years ago. And so but all she knows is that her grandmother had told her black people grow tails. And so everyone else was like, wait, you were taught this? I was like, yeah, that's what she was taught. But she had never been able, she wasn't going to go up to one of her black classmates. Can I see your tail? That wasn't, but there was she felt safe enough in the environment to be like, all right, I have a question. That's all right. And she felt safe enough to ask it in front of everybody, which was, on one hand, beautiful, and also like, wow.
You have to get fixed because he could get asked.
Yeah. Other questions or comments or queries or conundrums? Okay.
I was just thinking about, this is probably more religion than anything.
Sure.
What's going on college campuses now where you don't have that freedom of dialogue anymore because somebody's going to punish you. So you have Palestinians versus Israelis, and we had encampments last year on campuses like Mercer College. You would have thought that they would have that there, and it's so disturbing to me, and I think a lot of people, that we're losing that chance to have differences of opinion and dialogue without fearing for your life, or just fear of being injured. And what happened? I had a philosophy professor at Northeastern who brought in a couple of Hare Krishnas to give a whole lecture. That was bizarre. But he was open to all these different philosophies, and we talked about Eastern philosophy versus Western and all that. And I'm like, what's going on now? You can't have these dialogues anymore.
I don't know. See, it's because the kids on those college campuses, a lot of them were mine. So, I have students who were at Columbia, who were at Brandeis, who were at Harvard, right, MIT. So when I'm seeing it, I saw a couple times on the news, and I'm like, that's one of my kids. On both sides and in the middle. So, I'm seeing people, and I'm texting folks, are you okay? Are you sick? And so, on the one hand, there is can people have civil conversation anymore? Question. And on the other hand, I think back over our history in this country and go, can people ever really had civil conversation? I can think back to many examples from decade after decade after decade where there's a hot button issue on a college campus and someone ends up hurt, killed, want to go back to Kent State or we want to, yeah, these things have happened historically, so I don't think it's a new thing with these kids in this generation. I think it's just a human thing, and it just pops up every once in a while, but then there are also campuses where you never could have an open and honest conversation about things. And there are other campuses where that is a part of the DNA of the college campus that you would have these open communications. So I think what we're seeing right now, or we're just seeing it right now, is, I don't want to say it's also partially COVID, but I think it's also partially COVID, in terms of the kids who I know were they spent so much of their time closed off from each other and only communicating through social media, and now there's something for them to feel passionate about, for good reasons, on all sides, feeling passionate, and have an outlet for it, finally. Most of the people I know, and things that I heard, were saying that a lot of the violence on campuses were not from people who were actually on those campuses. Every kid who I talked to was like, yeah, we don't know who those people were. It doesn't matter what side they were supporting. It was always actually outside agitators who were just causing problems. So I'm always wary of what are these kids doing? Because often it's not even those kids. The Black Lives Matter protests, we saw the exact same thing, where it's legitimately people who were, the FBI finally released data, it was like, yeah, it wasn't actually most of those protesters, there were other people who were coming in and doing things. So, which also is is an American tradition also, like coming in and doing something and blaming other people for it. So I think civil discourse still exists amongst the young. I think they are more afraid of talking openly about things publicly, but within their groups, in their smaller groups, they're doing that. Like we were talking about, friends who are of different opinions can sit down at a dinner table and have a conversation, but they might be yelling at the stranger who thinks the opposite thing, and that's who they're yelling at across picket lines. But their best friend, like a video of kids of mine, who are we're trapped in conversations where their friends think different things, but they're talking to their friends. Somebody who at Columbia, who are I feel this, but they're still close. But they'll get the protest yelling at somebody else who they don't know. So I think it's partially that question of, if we're having these individual conversations, there's still hope. But when you're in a mob at a picket line, then yeah, that's the enemy, not the opposition. Let's just yell at those people and throw things, which is always bad, usually. We're at 8:28, so if there are any final questions, I know you guys finished promptly at 8:30. Thank you again.
Lots of things